even sometimes people question this very philosophy of the fact that climate is something which is a natural process. It's been happening for millions of years. So what's so new great about it, and why should I be worried about it? But yet the kind of impacts that you can see on this slide seems to suggest that yes, there is something critically wrong with the way our planet is currently going through. So it's just not India, it's Britain, it's UK, most of Europe, it's France, Spain, Tunisia, China, name the country and you have all kinds of issues happening around the world. So that is where we are looking at in terms of the reality of climate that is hitting us now. And as I said, this is yesterday also I spoke about it. It's not about just a weather issue. It's not about just a temperature issue. It's about an economy issue currently that we are all facing. And sometimes it's very politicized as well. It's a very political issue that we are facing in terms of addressing the climate issue. So the energy use and demand is something that is the other side of climate change. So there's on one side a lot of impacts taking place. We are trying to understand the damage being caused by it. But then on the other side, let's also look at the root cause and try and address that issue in terms of saying. And one of the biggest root cause that we should look at is this whole idea of how well are we consuming energy and based on the demand around us. Now, as average citizens, as students, as perhaps even a citizen, we often never consider these issues at all. It's an important element for us to look at and try and think about how we as citizens are actually responsible for this problem. And I'll tell you a little bit of these instances at some point here. And then a little bit of an economics and innovation in terms of how do we look at this from a larger perspective of the cost implication of the use of energy as well. So having said that, I mentioned this, that it's not about just weather, it's also about how investment, technology deployment and human development that's going to shape the world for tomorrow. So I'll skip all these because these are more in terms of the basics. The risks to life on Earth because of climate change comes from different dimensions today. So whether it's glaciers, melting of polar ice caps, diminishing of certain species, or looking at water resources, the submergence of island nations or small islands, or even, for example, spread of pests and vector-borne diseases. All of these are all huge impacts that are being felt. So therefore, the question comes is, who is causing the problem? Now, this is where the global perspective becomes extremely important for us to understand. Is it India which is causing the problem? Or is it the United States which is causing the problem? Or is it perhaps someone else? The answer is obviously not easy to quantify here. But yet, historically, I think there is information available. Industrialization started to take place in the Western world. The use of fossil fuels became a major concern. The world is close to what we call the tipping point of more than 2 degrees, where of average global warming, which could actually devastate a lot of natural ecosystems on which we as human beings are completely dependent. Water, agriculture, to name 2 important ones, because survival of human beings depends on the availability of water, fresh water, and of course agriculture, because food crops are important for us, and therefore economies actually develop around these issues, and therefore the link between economies and climate change can become very, very it's a direct correlation here. Having said that, where are these issues coming from? So there are 3 points that need to be understood here in terms of the fact that fossil fuels are perhaps one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And one of them is coming from this increase in coal-fired power plants around the world. Now, and at some point I'll also show you about why the world always developed around a coal-based economy. 100 years back also, coal was the major source of fossil fuel. In fact, it's even today, and that is why I said that if we as a country in India want to grow, you need that coal to establish a certain quality of life in our country. Why? Because your use of energy is now increasing. Now that's my second point that I'm mentioning here, and I'm specifically parked that word energy in red here, is because there's increasing use of energy everywhere. It's a lifestyle and consumption issue. All the more reason today, because ever since technology became very digitalized in the last 20-25 years, the use of energy has tremendously grown. Now you go back 30-40 years back, the use of energy was primarily towards one or two things only in our daily lifestyle, which is I need to light up my house, I need to probably get a decent amount of air circulation in my house, so I must probably be having fans or whatever it is, and maybe the odd house used to have an air conditioner. That was my concern, or that was my only link with the use of energy largely, and maybe a little bit of use of kitchen and household appliances just for my daily lifestyle. However, all that has changed tremendously in the last 20 years, ever since digitalization became such an important part of our lifestyle. So this is where I think it's important for everyone to understand that today we are talking about a digitalized world where we really can't survive without maybe a laptop or maybe as a mobile phone. Now, if I'm going to ask, and I often ask this question in my class every time I teach, is this: how many of you people can survive without a mobile phone for 2 days? Not a single hand goes up, because that's what it is. The mobile phone is actually becoming center stage in our life today. And obviously these mobile phones have to be charged, and that's coming at a cost. That's a cost is that we are actually consuming energy from some source here. So the increasing use of energy is now becoming significant from a personal lifestyle issue, and also in terms of consumption. The consumption of products, the availability of products means that there is access to a lot of energy for various industries to increase their use of energy as well. And it's a lifestyle issue. We are now in a stage where we actually have access to a lot of products, and if those products have to be developed, there is going to be a high consumption of energy everywhere. That's a complete shift that has happened today, leading to a lot of usage of fossil fuels. Now, I'm not come to the solutions as well, but I'm just looking at the root cause of why our greenhouse gas emissions have gone up tremendously in the last 20 years or so. The third important point that needs to be noted here is this whole idea about mobility. Now again, go back to 30-40 years back, mobility was not something that was a very normal practice for many of us. You could probably talk to your parents or grandparents and they would probably tell you that there could be the odd travel that would happen once in a while. But today travel has become such an important part or integral part of our life, whether it is within the city or whether it is an intercity or it's outside the country. We are looking at an enormous amount of travel that is taking place. Mobility has become so easy for most of us because of access to a variety of mobility options available, whether it's private vehicles, whether it's freight, or whether it's aviation. And so there comes in an angle of how emissions are being let out into the atmosphere because of various transport related greenhouse gas emissions. So that the entire process of how our economies have shifted and our lifestyle has changed has resulted in an huge amount of emissions that are now clearly becoming a key factor in terms of addressing this issue of climate change. So obviously the solutions will likely to be coming from many of these issues itself in terms of how we need to address them. Then comes this whole entire issue about how the world is seeing itself in terms of climate change. Are there any key countries which are responsible for it? So I'm obviously looking at one of the biggest developed nations, which is the United States of America. One of the biggest nations in the world where energy consumption is probably at its highest today. The per capita consumption of energy in the US, or in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and you compare it to a country like India, even today is perhaps at least 20 times more in the United States. Many of us aspire to go to the United States for various job opportunities. We go and live there. We have people who are living there. The concern is obviously that I am having a good life out there. Perhaps. I'm not obviously saying it's individual choice. But the fact is that you've got to see what is the way in which my carbon footprint is currently being seen. So if you see from a per capita concept, India is perhaps about 1.7 tons per carbon dioxide in CO2 emissions on an average, whether the US is somewhere in the region of 20 or 21. So as I said, it's almost 20 times the kind of higher than an average Indian citizen. So there you are. The context of how large consumption patterns are there in many parts of the world is tremendously high. Therefore, higher emissions from those countries. However, it's important to understand that developing nations like India and China are equally not very far behind. They are not far behind in terms of the total amount of emissions that are coming from these countries as well. As I had also mentioned that while some of the developed nations like the United States or most of North America or Europe industrialized 60-70 years back itself, developing countries like China and India started to get into the phase of development, strong, rapid economic development only in the last 30-40 years. Yeah, prior to that, I don't think even we as countries did not grow so rapidly. And today we are growing very rapidly. The same goes with China and many of the Southeast Asian countries. So such rapid economic growth can come only when there is high energy consumption. So there's a direct correlation between economic growth and energy consumption. And that is the ironic situation that I'm talking about today, is that if I want development in my country, I have to consume energy. And there is a catch, that is the catch-22 situation here, is that how do I therefore start looking at climate change as an issue? Now do I address this? And then we'll come to that in some time. Then the whole issue is also looking at the European Union, which is a conglomerate of at least about 28 to 30 countries, which is equally responsible for as an industrialized group for all the problems of climate change. And today the EU is actually taking very strong measures on variety of aspects of climate change. So I've just put in some countries which are critical in this whole issue. And in recent times, I think there are new issues which have suddenly come up. So, for example, the Russia-Ukraine crisis has further accelerated the problem of climate change in many ways. Because Ukraine is probably one of those biggest, or rather I would say the Russians have been one of the biggest suppliers of natural gas. And because of the continuing crisis in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, there are issues about availability of natural gas, which is seen as a potential solution to climate change. And therefore, there are issues now in many European nations and Germany as well, as saying that what do we look at? Do we look at an alternative? So these new issues are cropping up, and it also means that we are looking at the crisis in West Asia, which has been there for now almost 6 months. And we really do not know how the shift in local power dynamics will drive some of the concerns of West Asia. So the security of energy supply is both a risk and an opportunity. And this is where I think we need to understand, and I raised this point about why West Asia is such an important element for sustainable energy, because a lot of natural gas is currently centered around many countries in the Gulf in West Asia. And therefore, just to give you one example, Iran and Qatar, two of the big nations have a very high resource of natural gas and are actually supplying it to many parts of the world. So that security of energy that I'm talking about is a huge risk and opportunity. In Pune, for example, many households use natural gas. Delhi uses a lot of natural gas. Mumbai uses a lot of natural gas. Where is it coming from? It's largely coming from some of these countries that I've just referred to. And however, the political and the dynamic situation that is emerging there could also become a concern. So we're also talking about solutions that are currently available, but yet the international conflicts can actually create some kind of an imbalance in terms of the availability of these fuel sources for our requirement. So the uptake of sustainable energy options can also become a concern, although we know that there are solutions there. So there are these emerging threats that I would really want to flag here to just give you an idea that climate change transcends all kinds of dimensions here. It's also about countries, it's also about local impacts, it's also about issues that are happening currently in the entire world scenario. Having said that, I'll just give you a flowchart here. So while I don't want to get into the details of this flowchart, but I really want to mention here is that if you see the top half of this flowchart, it tells you that a large part of our consumption a large part of our greenhouse gas emissions is coming from the energy sector. Why am I emphasizing on the energy sector? Because that is where almost 65 to 70% of the world's GHG emissions are coming from. And therefore, it makes sense to start addressing the problems of the energy sector if I need to find a solution to climate change. Just to add to that, what about the remaining 30%? If about 65% is coming from energy, where is the remaining emissions coming from? So the remaining emissions are coming from various industrial processes, factories, production of various materials. It's also coming from a concept called land use change and forestry. Now, interestingly, yesterday I was mentioning about the impact of climate change on forests. And it's ironic, just like agriculture, that while forests are getting impacted, forests are also a contributor to climate change, which means there's almost about 18 to 20% of the world's climate problem is coming from forests. Why? Simply from deforestation. 18.3% of the world's deforestation is leading to climate change. And that's an extremely high number that we're talking about. Afforestation or restoration of degraded ecosystems is not really taking place. And so there is actually a negative aspect of, you see this slide also, it says minus 1.5%, minus 0.5%, which means that obviously there is a problem of how some of these are not happening in our cities or maybe elsewhere as well. And the last is about waste. Now, this is often a topic which many of us perceive it on a daily basis, but don't seem to be too worried about existing. Yeah, waste is the responsibility of maybe some agency which will come and pick up my waste from my house and then take it somewhere and dump it, whatever it is, and we have no clue about what's really happening to it. You'll be actually surprised to know that waste constitutes anywhere between, when this data is a little old, it says 3.6, but it's anywhere between 4 and 5% of the world's GHG emissions. And that's very significant in terms of a cumulative amount of emissions that are actually getting caused from a global point of view. It's huge. The amount of waste that we generate as human beings is absolutely enormous, and sometimes you have to actually look at it in the context of, as individuals, that what am I doing? What am I really doing to address this issue of waste? Can I even stop it? And the answer comes very critically, yes. The answers are very, very, very straightforward in terms of saying that yes, if I should not create waste, I should not create waste. It's as simple as. It's a point to ponder for students and for maybe even college campuses as well, as to how do we do it. And sometimes the solutions can be very simple. And I'm happy to take questions if anybody wants to actually connect on this particular issue. Is that what are the ways in which this happens? But having said that, the biggest contributor still remains almost 65 to 70% coming from this large core energy sector. So it doesn't mean the solution should not come from the rest, but the focus on energy becomes critical for us if I need to address the solution of climate change. Where is it coming from even within the energy sector? Electricity and heat. So this is slightly technical, but nevertheless I'll try and make it as simple as possible. Is the consumption of electricity that we are actually doing today is also growing. most households or industrial establishments use a lot of electricity today. Yeah. Some of them want 24/7 electricity. Some of them, of course, depending on their nature of their work, use it partially. Households, all of us need access to electricity. We can't do without it. As I told you, some years back, electricity was only used for lighting, fans, and maybe a few home appliances. But today, I think it's expanded significantly. You look at a multitude of options ranging from IT-related equipments and where we need them as 24/7. So the consumption of electricity is also gone up from a cumulative point of view. And every time we consume electricity, we are releasing CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. It's as straightforward as that. Again, solutions cannot come by saying that we become an activist by saying, no, I will not consume electricity. Obviously, we need to do it. If I need to aspire in terms of building a growth economy for my country, I need that electricity to be more productive in what I'm doing. The other aspect is heat. Unfortunately, or rather I would say fortunately, we don't have too much issues related to heat because we are not a temperate country. We are a tropical nation, India. But however, if you travel abroad to Europe or most of North American region, heat is a major concern there, where all your homes are centralized heating systems are available. And heat again releases energy and converted to greenhouse gas emissions up into the atmosphere. The part of the reason why most of Europe and most of North America have high energy consumption is coming because of these centralized heating systems out there. Because of harsh winters out there, there's a lot of heating systems, and that is also adding to the energy consumption. Whereas India does not have that, except maybe in some places in the north of this country. But barring that, heat is not a concern. But for us, the other side is the consumption or the use of air conditioners. Again, a debatable issue is that a lot of us depend on ACs, need ACs. The question is it's not a question of saying that I need to do away with ACs, because air conditioners consume energy. Energy consumption again leads to emissions into the atmosphere. So the question is, what level of ACs am I using? What type of ACs am I using? How long am I using? There are several behavioral aspects in all this which need to be considered when I start utilizing my air conditioners. So in a sense, the contributor to greenhouse gas emissions largely comes from the energy resource, and that is where the solutions also lie in many ways. Let's look at this in the context of the entire world, and you'll be actually surprised to know that the world is made up of probably about 200 odd countries today. I don't know the exact number of countries that exist in the world, but it's about roughly 25 to 30 nations around the world which contribute to almost 85% of the total man-made greenhouse gas emissions. The anthropogenic emissions are coming from just about 25 or 30 countries around the world. In a world which has got about 200 odd countries, this is the small number of nations which contribute to a large chunk of the emissions. And who are they? And I've just put them in bold a bit here. Largely, it's not that the others are not contributing, but I've just sort of had a set of countries across the world in different geographies as well. So there's obviously US, China, Russia, India. Then there's also a few European countries. There are countries in the African continent. There's in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, all of these, if you look at India, is almost about 4% of the global emissions. So, of these, some of these countries are now taking significant action. The ones that I've put out in bold are also the ones where there's a lot of work going on. I mentioned about why the European Union is taking such strong measures today towards addressing the issue of climate change. And so forth. There are other countries also trying to address these issues with mixed results. I won't say that everybody is doing great on these issues. There are problems. There are some countries which have failed to address some of the issues of the emissions. There are some countries which have been very strong in terms of pushing regulation. And that is where I think this whole concept of climate law comes in very clearly. Is that some of them have got extremely strong regulations, EU being one of them. Is the EU regulations related to climate law is today so stringent that it's also ensuring that many other countries follow those norms today. So I'm not going to get into those details, but just to highlight the fact that there are countries which are taking action and there are some countries which have not done significantly well. As far as India is concerned, yes, we have taken certain measures, but I think we also have a long way to go if we have to address our own emissions. The argument or the debate often happens is that we are a developing nation. Why should we even be taking action? Now, this has been there for a while, where India, whenever it pleads its case with the world community between developing and developed nations, the argument always comes that historically developed nations created the problem, and why should developing now pay the price for it? That doesn't mean that India as a country should not be taking action on it. And of course, we have taken some very strong action in many areas, which is important for a country like India. Yes, it's about 4% and significant for a country like India. So if you look at this little graph here, which also tells us that if you start putting it from a country-wise or a grouping-wise perspective, it also means that about approximately 20% of the world's emissions come from the US itself. That's a huge context. You add China to it and you add the European Union to it, and you have about 30 odd countries coming in, which contributes nearly 50%. And then you further add countries like Russia, India, Japan, emerging economies like Brazil, Canada, South Korea, countries like Indonesia, Australia, and Ukraine, and so on and so forth. It's almost about 80 to 85% of the world's emissions are coming from this small group of countries. And then this dotted line is the remaining countries which are adding up to 100, which are significantly not even there in terms of the emissions. Or let's say maybe some of the African nations, they are not even energy countries at all. They have no contribution to energy in the sense that many of them are not having high levels of energy consumption at all. And yet, these are the countries which face the brunt of the climate impacts on the region. So it's actually an unequal world that we live in, where one set of countries is causing a problem and the impact is being felt somewhere else. And that is the complexity of this entire climate issue that I've been talking about. And for us, solutions can come by not only these developed nations taking action on it, but also in terms of how the impacted countries should be looking at adaptation options. From a per capita footprint perspective, now this is what I was telling you all some time back. Look at where is India and look at where some of the developed nations are. In fact, Australia, Canada, and US, extremely high per capita consumption of CO2 per person per year on an average. These numbers might change, fluctuate on an annual basis every year, depending on the kind of action that these countries take. But on a broad scale, this is the context that becomes much easier for us to set here in terms of the fact that much of the developed world has very high carbon footprints in terms of CO2 consumption per person. And countries like China and India, in fact, even China is growing, and India is also more significantly, India has grown to about 1.6 or 1.7, is also equally growing. But yet, from a per capita perspective, this is seen as something very important. However, it doesn't mean that India and China should not be doing much about it. Because the converse argument is also there in terms of saying that China and India have a huge population base, and therefore when you actually start putting in per capita and divide it in terms of your population, it will always show it as low. When you see it as an absolute CO2 emission, both China and India are in the top 5 countries in the world. So that is the volume of emissions that is coming from countries like China and India is actually very high from an absolute sense. So where we really sort of try and look at it from a per capita is the fact that we have huge populations. So while the argument might be that yes, we should not be doing too much about it, nevertheless, on an absolute scale, it is quite significant for us to take action. And therefore, I think today both developing nations like India and China are actually taking serious action.